was 42 when the letter came, though it felt as if it had been delivered to some earlier version of myself. A woman with softer hands and a thinner skin. A woman who still mistook silence for safety. The envelope wore a stripe of dust like a bruise. The ink had bled where a careless drop of rain had touched it. My maiden name, the one I had folded and put away years before, stared up at me like a face I hadn't seen since childhood. Anna Morell. Thin script, careful and almost apologetic, as if the pen itself knew it had no right to speak. For a long time after Daniel vanished, I carried the habit of looking out the window at dusk, watching the road grow purple and then black, expecting, God knows why, a shape to resolve from the dark. It became a private superstition. If I held my breath for 3 slow counts, while the day's last light thinned between the trees, perhaps the latch would lift and his boots would find the porch again. I held my breath for 3,650 dusks. A decade is a wide river for one breath. In the end, I learned what women in our town whispered like a psalm against their teeth. You can drown without water if you hold your longing long enough. The first year after he left, I defended him. It must have been an accident, a storm on the bay, a debt he had gone to settle that turned sour and required a journey. He will send for me, I told my sister, who came by with soup and eyes that settled on every empty hook by the door. You'll see. He will write. The word write broke against my teeth like hard candy, too sweet and too brittle. A week passed, then a month. Then the sympathy turned into an odd kind of scrutiny, as if my silence had become suspicious. Men asked careful questions with their mouths and careless questions with their eyes. Women wash in their pity with rules. A man does not vanish unless he meant to. The police came twice and took notes that looked like ants swarming the white of the page. They searched the docks, cracked the shells of bars open to look inside, came back with their palms up. I tucked those palms into my dreams, tried to warm them. I kept his shirts for 2 years. Not out of piety, out of fear that if I folded the cloth into neat, breathless squares, nothing would be left to argue with. I kept his razor dull as a relic. I kept the orange bottle of cheap cologne that smelled like summer cut with iron. I kept his pillow uncreased, then resented its clean persistence, its refusal to bear the weight of a head. Every Sunday, I washed the sheets and shook them out over the line, and sometimes, when the wind climbed up from the creek and filled the cotton with breath, I saw his shape there, a ghost made of laundry, and I would speak to it, not with words exactly, but with a small instinct that tried to make sense of a world missing one particular pair of hands. I worked. There were mornings I rose before the sky decided itself and baked bread for the cafe on Cedar, the kind of bread that carries its own light when you cut into it. I planted. I learned the shape of grief with a trowel, the thing that goes down and turns the earth and brings worms up blinking, surprised at air. I learned the pleasure of tiredness that isn't fear. I learned to sleep with my back to the door. I learned that there are silences that one can live inside without choking. Robert came in my 3rd winter alone, on a day that had more gray than ours. He wore a wool coat that had once been a fine blue, and now was the exact shade of surrender. He had 2 girls, April and Lotta, who sat at a cafe table the first time I saw them, breaking a muffin into equal, solemn halves like priests at a cold altar. Their mother had died quietly, the way some lights go out, no crack, no smoke, just a soft extinguishing that leaves you blinking at the dark. He was a postal clerk then, a man who measured distance in stamps and breath, and who suspected that most human messes began when people tried to rush what should be born slowly. He did not court me the way Daniel had. Daniel had filled a room the way a violin fills a hallway, high and eager and asking to be heard. With him, I had been 21, all nerve and promise, and a willingness to mistake restlessness for tenderness. The night we decided to marry, he had opened a window and declared that the stars had said yes before we even asked. I misread that omen. I thought it meant fate liked us. In truth, it only meant he was always listening to something very far away. Robert wooed me by learning the names of my plants. The first day, he noticed, without being told, that the hollyhocks along the fence had powder on their leaves, and 2 days later he arrived with sulfur and an old brush and a look that said, "May I help?" He took the trash out without ceremony, and when rain came heavy one night in April, he did not wake me to watch it, as Daniel would have, coaxing me into the doorway where we would laugh at the sky's theatrics. Instead, he padded quietly to the kitchen and moved the pail beneath the leak in the roof so the drops found a new destination. To learn to be loved like this, gently and without spectacle, I had to unlearn the sting of being left. It took time. He waited. We married after 6 seasons of friendship. I told him the truth the night before, that I had been a wife once and then a widow without a body to bury, that there was a man-shaped space in my life that I had learned to have conversations around, that I could promise steadiness, but not that bright, blind young heat. He said, eyes down, hands worried together. He was not looking for thunder. I wanted to say yes because I was tired. I said yes because I recognized, in the quiet shape of his waiting, a new kind of courage. It is brave, you know, to build a life with someone who has already been defeated by the weather of another life. He brought his daughters into the house the way a man brings fire in from the cold, carefully and with gratitude. April was sharp-eyed and already good at folding herself too small. Lotta still believed the world would put a hand out if she slipped. We made rules. We established inventory. The red bowl is for Sunday poppy seed batter. The small broom is Lotta's job. The big broom is April's when she is angry. We made a family by performing it until it stuck. They called me Mama on the morning a hurt dog slunk into the yard, and I wrapped it in an old coat and said the words soft like a prayer. I cried after they went to school, not because I was happy or sad, but because the word had finally found me again. Life grew a skin. We had a porch we sat on. We argued about nothing and then forgave each other by cooking too much food. Robert fixed the leak permanently. I became adept at finding second-hand boots, one size too large for growing girls, and stuffing the toes with newspaper. We did not talk about Daniel. And then, the letter. 3 lines, and they did more damage than 10 years of silence had. My dearest Anna, if you will have me, I am coming home. Yours, always, Daniel. The postmark was from a town I had never heard of, that sounded like it had been named by a man who ran out of names. I turned the envelope over and over until my thumbs went numb, as though something more might be written on the flap if I chafed it hard enough. I tried to be angry first. Anger is easier to hold. It has edges. But grief came ahead of it, the old, unhousebroken thing that parks itself in the hall and breathes loudly. I hid the letter in my apron pocket like contraband. I told Robert after 3 dinners that I barely tasted. He was washing the last plate and turned the water off as if it were a radio playing a song he didn't like. He dried his hands on the good towel, the embroidered one I never used because it felt like spoiling, and he faced me. "Do you want him back?" he asked. I could not meet that question head-on. It had a blade. "I want answers," I said. "Want and want not are 2 brothers who fight in the same yard," he said, not to scold, but to name the weather correctly so we wouldn't be caught without coats. He slept on the far edge of the bed that night. In the morning, he made the oatmeal too thick, the way he did when something sat, undigested, at the back of his mind. The girls ate around the tension the way fish find the space around a rock. I told them a truth that was not the whole truth, and they accepted it because they were 13 and 10, and the world still had clear lanes painted for what could be asked. The day Daniel came back, May pinned the clothesline with wind and honey. I was watering the new rosemary, the hard kind whose stems, if you close your eyes, smell like a seaside church. I heard boots on the gravel and did not look. I knew his step, as one knows an old wound by the way the rain finds it. He said my name as if it were a stone he meant to throw lightly, and then worried, at the last instant, that it might sink. I turned, and my first thought, ridiculous, was that time had been fair. He was lined and gray at the temples. One eye had gathered crow's feet like stitches someone forgot to cut. He had a scar at his jaw I didn't know the story of, and I resented the entire biography of that scar for being written without my witness. Anna, he said again, and I nodded, because what else was there in the dictionary for a woman in my place? Daniel. If he expected me to fall on him, to gather him into myself, like rain into dry earth, then a part of him died right there when he met my eyes and found only caution. I do not mean cruelty. Caution is a refusal to drown again in the same river. I have a family, I said, stated, not argued. I have a husband, 2 girls. So I know, he said. I asked at the cafe. They told me. His mouth twitched at the corner, the old jesting habit elbowing through, as if we might laugh one day about his absence the way people laugh about a trip that was longer than expected. My stomach hardened. Why? The old word. It came out flat and edged like a key. He sat on the step without being told to, hands between his knees, thumb rubbing the joint of the other like a rosary. I ran, he said. I ran from a debt that wanted more than money. Men who don't care whether they are owed cash or blood are not patient men. He paused. And then I ran from my running, and by the time there was no one at my back, I had become someone I could not bear to bring to your door. I told myself you were better without me. That lie. I fed it. It grew strong. 10 years, I said, because a number is proof. He nodded. There were letters, he said. You did not get them. Or maybe I did not send them. It blurs. Forgive me. No, that's too big a thing to ask. Allow me to say it. Forgive me, he said softly, and the syllables trembled as if they were walking barefoot over stones. Robert stood in the doorway. He had the dish towel in his hand, like a white flag he didn't know how to wave. He met Daniel's eyes, and whatever men say to each other without words moved between them like the electric before a storm. The girls were at school. I was grateful for the ordered world that hid them until 3. You can stay at the inn, I said. I heard the cruelty in the preposition and could not pull it back. At, not with. A place at the edge of our town, not in its heart. He nodded. I'm not here to take you back, he said. I wanted to look you in the face and say that the leaving was mine, and the loss was ours, and the missing was yours most of all. I wanted to not die with that still between us. It is an ugly mercy, to be told your pain has a witness after its worst hour has passed. He left for the inn. Robert came to sit beside me on the step, where the heat had stored itself like an old cat. We did not touch. He is not a ghost, Robert said finally, but he haunts. I laughed then, a small, mean, exhausted sound. I wanted him to be dead, I said, and I saw him flinch because he was good and did not like the taste of such honesty. Not because I wished him harm, because I could have finished the story then. A widow is a thing people know how to stand near. Do you love him? He asked. A fair question wears simple clothes. I love the woman who loved him, I said, and I grieve her. He nodded and pressed his thumb into the hollow of my wrist, the kind of touch that says, I am here with you inside this ugly room of truth. The next morning, we walked to the inn together, Robert and I, carrying a loaf wrapped in a tea towel, because grief and bread have always been cousins. Daniel opened the door in a shirt I did not recognize, one with a frayed collar someone else had mended. Come in, he said. I've seen worse rooms, I said, and he smiled without brightness. We sat at the small table. The words arranged themselves, not in the order we would have chosen, but in the order time demanded. He spoke first. He told us about the debt he had not paid, a loan for a boat he never bought, because he drank it and won it and lost it again. A story with the embarrassing smell of youth and a too-yet hunger for luck. He described a man named Kettle who did not boil, but simmered. A man who waited outside doors for hours because he had made patience a weapon. He described a night at the harbor when something was supposed to be moved and was not, and how a hand found him in an alley and pressed into his neck and told him that he had 1 week to become a different man. "And so I did," he said, and gave the barest smile, bitter enough to peel paint. He went inland with a new name and a job that paid in cash. He learned to sleep in shifts. He learned to wake when a door breathed. "Why not tell me?" I said. I was not jealous of his fear. I envied its clear errands. He had had a purpose, even if it was to live small. I had had only a question. "Because I was ashamed," he said simply, "and because I told myself a story where you were safer without me. And then that story liked itself too much to end." He looked at Robert then, and I saw in his face something like Apology's older brother, the one who has earned its gray hair. "I am not asking you to forgive me for her sake," he said to him. "I am asking you to allow me to speak my guilt out loud where she can hear it." Robert, who hated the theater of emotion, nodded. "You owe us no drama," he said, "only facts." Daniel accepted the rebuke like a cup of cold water. For the next days, he came to our house after the girls left for school. He sat on the porch, and I brought him coffee, not because he was guest or ghost, but because I remembered he took it with sugar only when the sky was low. He watched me weed and asked the names of things as if they were friends he might meet later. He listened to stories about April's stubborn tests and Lotta's insistence on sleeping with 1 foot out of the covers, convinced that this kept the night from swallowing her whole. He watched Robert and me move around the kitchen without asking how we had learned each other's quiet. He recognized the choreography of marriage and refused to insult it by pretending it was nothing. On the 4th day, the town caught up. There is nothing as fast as a mouth armed with a secret it doesn't own. Women who had once pitied me measured my face for signs of indecency. Men shook Daniel's hand with their mouths curved in amusement or judgment. It looks the same from the outside. At the grocer's, I heard the word bigamy hissed like a snake in a nursery, but I did not turn. We are not responsible for every snake that wants us. I told the girls the kind of truth their age could bear. After supper, I sat them at the table and laid my hands palm down so there would be no question of hiding and said, "I was married to a man who left. He is back now. He is not your father. Your father is your father." Their faces did the mathematics of family and wanted to show me their work, prove they could solve for X. "Will he stay?" April asked, her voice held still, the way children speak when they suspect that the ground might be soft. "He has a room at the inn," I said. "He will not live with us." Lotta looked at me with the brave audacity of 10. "Are you going to leave like he did?" she asked. God bless her. "No," I said, and the word was a stone I put down in the middle of the river. We could step on it. That night, I lay awake and tried to inventory the parts of me that belonged to which past. The body is a clever archivist. It stores the smell of a man's neck and the sound of his laugh and the way he chews the inside of his cheek when he is planning a lie. It also stores the absolute weight of another man's palm at the base of your skull when the world is unkind. It was a miracle that I had room for any future at all. On the 5th day, Daniel asked for a walk. We took the path behind the Miller place, where the tall grass makes a sound like hands rubbing together. "I married again," he said, as if a confession had been cued behind his teeth and was tired of waiting its turn. Her name was Sarah. She was kind in a way that made me angry at first, because I did not know what to do with it. She died in winter. It was quiet. We had no children. I learned, after, how to do the things her hands had always done. He paused. "I came back not to take you from a life you built, but to keep my first life from ending with my back turned." I stopped walking. "You came to look at yourself," I said carefully, because sometimes the truth is not an accusation, but a naming. He nodded. "And for you to look at me and tell me what you see." I considered him, the scar I did not know, the new habit of pushing his thumb into his other palm. "I see a man who believes that consequences can be paid for with the right words," I said. He accepted it the way a man accepts a doctor's diagnosis he suspected already. And? He asked, wanting more, always wanting more. And I see a boy who was afraid and then got good at it. And I see a man who is tired of being good at fear. He let out a breath that sounded like metal cooling. I am, he said. I am so tired. We built a plan that was not a plan. He would stay until Sunday. He would not come to church or to the market the morning before. He would not ask me for a private goodbye. He would not kiss my hand or call me my girl, the way he used to. The way that word could make me 16 and empty-headed with hope. He would leave me the forwarding address written legibly and with urgency, and he would allow me, in my own time or never, to send him a letter that did not contain forgiveness, because forgiveness is not a letter. It is a long walk that stops and starts, and sometimes ends in a place you do not like. On Saturday, Kettle came. Men like him are not content to be in a story only as a memory. They insist on a scene. He arrived at dusk with 2 other men who smelled faintly of river and old tobacco, and he stood in our yard and did not knock, which is a way of saying, I have knocked enough. Robert saw him first. He stepped onto the porch with his body arranged not to be stupid, a careful gathering of muscle over bone as if he were a door that could hold. Looking for Daniel, the man said, tongue pushing the name around as if he meant to taste its salt. Robert replied with the truth. He is at the inn, and then offered the lie that could save a life. But he left this afternoon. Kettle smiled like a man trying on expressions at a shop and not finding his size. We heard he came to make amends, he said, and his mouth twisted the word amends into something that would not fit through a church doorway. He came to say words he already spent, Robert said, and in that moment I loved him so fiercely it frightened me, because the history of my love suddenly had a roof I did not want to lose to fire. They left, not convinced, but delayed. Daniel came from the back garden, where he had been kneeling by the rosemary, as if prayer was a task one could do in dirt. He had heard. I will go tonight, he said. They will not come to the inn if the innkeeper is clever, and he is. He turned to Robert. I owe you, he said, not a debt like theirs, one I can never measure. Robert looked over his shoulder at me and then back at Daniel. You owe her, he said, and you owe those girls the favor of being a lesson that ends well. Daniel nodded. That is the only way to accept a mercy correctly. I walked him to the road. The moon was one of those unfortunate shapes that make poems worse. Write to me, I said, surprising myself. Not to ask for anything, to say where you are, so I can picture it when the past tries to run me down. He nodded, as if given a chore he could do. Do you want to know where I kept you when I ran? He asked, and when I did not answer, he told me anyway. In my left pocket, he said, and I saw the boy in him again, the boy who thought metaphors could buy milk. You were a thing I touched to remind myself that not everything I had ever held had burned me, that I had once held something I did not deserve. And then you lost it, I said. And then I lost it, he agreed, and there was grace in the repetition, as if naming the loss twice could divide it. He left that night. The town exhaled, not because it cared about my peace, but because the air had been crowded with a story, and now there was room for other ones. I slept the next week like a person learning a new bed in an unfamiliar house. Robert was patient with the strangeness. He sat up with me when dreams worked me over and did not insist I tell them to him. He brought me water in the colorless hours when voices speak that ought not be believed. He told jokes a beat too slow so they would not startle me. The girls watched me as if they had been given a new species of mother and were looking for its feeding habits and sleep cycles. I made soup, I swept, I wrote a letter. The first letter I sent Daniel was an inventory. This is what is true. I am married. My husband is kind. The girls are taller than old grief. The rosemary you knelt by is thriving. Kettle came, and then he left, and I imagine he will die in a room with bad light. This is what is untrue. That I am the same. This is what is unfinished. The anger. This is what is not yours anymore. My forgiveness. This is what I am sending you anyway. A map to the road you already took. I folded the letter and sealed it with the back of a spoon, the way my grandmother had taught me, as if even the glue could be a ritual for persistence. He wrote back from a place with a road named for a tree that grows only in books. He was working at a mill, he said, a clean one where wood dust did not settle thick on the lungs. He rented a small room above a woman who baked in the early morning and sang to her bread. He described his day in patient, unrushed lines, the way a man writes who is trying to prove he has nothing to hide. He did not ask me to come. He did not ask for money or mercy or news beyond what I wanted to give. He put his return address clearly in the corner, as if writing a spell against vanishing. We became, briefly and strangely, correspondents, two ghosts riding across a country of regret and kitchen light. I told him when April bled for the first time, and how we sat on the bathroom floor together, and I told her, there is a way to live with a body that does not always respect you, but will carry you if you are careful with it. I told him when Lotta won a prize for a poem that had no rhymes, and still managed to sing. I told him when Robert sprained his wrist and changed temporarily, how he asked the world for help, which is to say, he asked it all. I told him the small, stubborn facts of domestic life that even grief cannot grasp, because their fingers are too fat for such small buttons. He wrote back stories about a man named M, who believed in bad jokes and clean floors, and a woman named Vita, who wore a red kerchief and cursed at God, as if they had grown up together, and a river that had the good sense to bend around a stubborn hill rather than try to bludgeon its way through. In winter, Daniel fell ill. He wrote me a short note that began, "Do not worry," which is the way a man writes when he is lonely and trying to dress the truth in a coat too small. He said he had a fever and a cough, and that the woman downstairs had made a soup that tasted like boiled honesty. He had no one to sit on the edge of his bed and push hair off his forehead while the hours banged their tin pails. I brought the letter to Robert and held it out like a wrong I could not solve. He read it and set it down, and then did the kindest thing. He did not tell me what to do. The worst prisons are choices made for you. I went for 3 days. I took the early train with a bag that had a clean towel, a small tin of salve, a book of psalms that worked even if you did not make a noise, and the blue cup he had once liked, the one chipped into the shape of a continent at the rim. I told the girls the truth that would not burden them. A friend is ill. I am going to nurse him. I kissed Robert like a promise we had both already kept. Daniel's room smelled like laundry that had forgotten to dry in the sun. His skin was hot and papery, a ridiculous combination that made me irritated with God for not inventing better materials. I fed him broth. I woke every 3 hours to spoon into him the medicine the doctor had left, with a warning not to get attached to outcomes. I wiped his forehead with the towel when the fever made him shine. I read aloud not the Psalms but the newspaper comics and the labels on the medicine, because words need not be holy to do work. He slept like a man who had been starving for rest. When he woke, he looked over at me and laughed a little at the shape of my face in his room, the way an old companion might laugh at finding a familiar chair in a new house. We did not speak of old things. A sick room has its own country, and any passports from the past are invalid there. He lived. The fever put down its weapons and left the city. The cough lingered like a bored uncle, but finally it, too, took its hat. On the 3rd day, he could sit long enough to look out the window and say that the tree outside looked like a woman telling a secret to a child. I nodded. I had seen it, too. On the 4th day, I left. I kissed his temple the way one kisses a child who is pretending not to need it. On the train back, I watched the fields pass and felt oddly faithful, not to him, but to the version of myself who had learned the difference between abandonment and mercy. There were years after that. I tell you this because stories like mine often stop at the dramatic, at the doorstep of the first husband and the second and the rain. That is not life. Life is a long lit hallway with carpets that stain and are cleaned and stain again. Years are not chapters. They are weather. Robert grew old the way a tree does, in rings, discreetly, adding a new quiet beneath the old. He retired from the post and took to whittling birds he did not show anyone except Lotta, who praised them as if they could fly. April left for a city whose name felt like a menu of syllables I could not quite order, and she found there a young woman who wore a jacket too big and carried tenderness like contraband. And April said she was in love, and I said, "Be kind," which is how we bless what we do not fully understand but want to last. Daniel wrote less often, not out of neglect, but because the spaces between the necessary words got wider. He moved rooms, he changed mills, he took up the habit of mending shirts with small, precise stitches, as if undoing some old sloppiness one fiber at a time. He spoke once of a woman who kept bees and let him taste honey warmed by the body of the hive. He did not say her name because he wanted to keep something safe from becoming a story. I applauded that. We don't always need witnesses to be honest. The day Robert died, the sky was in its best suit, crisp, cold, clean ached. He went easily, the way a good man leaves a room he does not want to disturb. I sat with him while the breath shortened into its last working shape and told him the small histories we had made together. The time the pie fell, and we ate the slumped fruit with spoons and called it something French. The time thunder took out the lights, and you did voices for the girls until they believed the dark was full of clowns. The time you admitted you were wrong without needing a judge. His fingers twitched a little at that, as if reaching for a verdict and finding only my hand. After, the girls arrived with their faces arranged for the grown-up work of death, and then, when the casseroles slowed, they let me hold their messy, luminous grief like a rope that kept me from floating away. I wrote to Daniel after the funeral. It was a letter with more white space than ink. He replied on paper that looked as if it had been folded and unfolded too many times before it reached me. He said the only right thing, "I am so sorry." He did not offer to come, as a younger version of him might have, hands full of the arrogance mercy sometimes wears. He held his distance like a prayer rug. I blessed him for it. I did not expect to live as long as I have lived. I am an old woman now, and memory is both balm and vandal. It soothes and it takes. When I walk to the edge of the garden and turn the way I have always turned toward the road at dusk, I still sometimes hold my breath for 3 counts without meaning to. Habit is a ghost with excellent posture. But I do not wait. Waiting is when you balance your soul on the tip of someone else's promise. I learned, finally, to stand with both feet on my own floorboards. You want a morale, perhaps. We are trained to take our stories with a vitamin tucked in. I can't offer one that will sit comfortably in your pocket. I can tell you what I have learned. That love is not a single thing, but a species with many subspecies, some nocturnal, some that bloom only after fires. That leaving is not always the worst thing that happens between two people. Sometimes the worst thing is the not knowing, the story that cannot be finished, and therefore keeps chewing. That kindness is not a weak muscle. That forgiveness is not the same as access. That you can measure a life not by how much you have held, but by how gently you learn to put things down. Years after his fever, years after Robert's last breath, years after Lotta's daughter, my grandchild, wrapped her tiny hand around the gold chain at my neck and drew me so close I smelled my own life on her hair, I went once to see Daniel without telling him. I was in his town for another errand, one of those errands that death invents to keep the living busy, and I walked past the mill, and then the bakery, and then a shop that sold things no one needs, and yet which felt as necessary as a polite lie. He was there, in the back, trying on a jacket too formal for a man who had spent his life in work shirts. He did not see me. I watched him in a mirror watching himself, and I saw a man who had aged into accuracy, not softness. He frowned at his reflection as if it were a paragraph with a word out of place, and then, with a small shrug, he let himself off the hook and put back on the coat that had kept him. I turned and left without speaking. It felt right to preserve the last flavor of our sentences, which had been spare and clean. Not every thread must be tied. Some should be allowed to trail where they can snag on light. Sometimes, in the night, when the house has gathered all its ticks and sighs, and the wind has decided to be somebody else's problem, I speak aloud as if I am dictating to my own soul. Anna, I say, the way he did that first afternoon on the steps, and then I answer myself with the voice Robert used when he said my name as if he were placing a dish gently on a shelf. It is foolish, and it is human. The past is a chorus and a crowd, and if I'm lucky, it stands far enough away to let me sleep. Once, a neighbor's boy asked me, because children are enemies of pretense, "Are you the woman with 2 husbands?" I laughed, which he took as permission to climb my porch rail and swing his legs until the blood agreed to stay in them. I am the woman with 1 husband, I said, and one story that tried to be a husband and failed. He considered that, and then asked for a cookie, which I gave him, because we are allowed to simplify for the young. For myself, I add, I am the woman who refused to call abandonment romance, and who learned to call mercy by its first name. In my bureau drawer, there is still the letter that began everything again. The paper has gone the color of tea left too long in a cup, and the folds have become rivers. I do not take it out often. When I do, I run my finger along the groove where the pen pressed the word always into the fiber. Words like always break their ankles when they run. I forgive the word, if not the man who wrote it. There is power in choosing precisely what to forgive. If I close my eyes now, I can still see that first morning after he left, the laundry blown fat with wind, the sun touching the edges of the sheet into a brightness that made me squint. That woman, a girl, really, wrapped in a name she had just begun to wear, watched her husband walk away with his hands in his coat pockets, unhurried, as if he were buying milk and coming back. I want to call out to her across the years, do not saint the disappearing, do not make altars out of absences, but I do not change her. I honor her, because it was she who learned to cook for 4 and then 5, who built a porch where a steady man could put his elbow down, and a child could write bad poems, and a dog could dream, and it was she who stood at the road on the last day and did not say come. When I die, and it is a sentence you must allow to be written, because yield is a word my bones are finally practicing, I hope heaven is a kitchen lit by a stubborn afternoon. I hope there is bread, and the good butter, and a knife that knows what it is for. I hope Robert is there, carving a bird he will declare unsatisfactory, and then bite with pleasure anyway. I hope Daniel is there too, but not at the table. I hope he is at the window, looking out, not as a ghost or a punishment, but as a man who knows he once left the wrong way, and is learning to arrive properly. I hope we nod to each other, the way people do in a new town, when they are careful not to make promises time won't let them keep. I hope, mostly, that in that light I can finally forgive myself not for what I did or did not do, but for the long season when I did not know how to be alive inside my own life. Until that kitchen, this one will do. The rosemary still thrives. April still calls every Sunday to tell me about impossible babies born in impossible circumstances who nonetheless breathe. Lotta still insists on sleeping with 1 foot outside the covers, even now, even with a husband who laughs and puts it back under when he wakes in the night and finds it cold. And I make bread. I press the heel of my hand into the dough and feel the muscle of the past answering back. I fold, I turn, I wait. It rises. It always does. If you are patient, and if the air is kind, and even if the air is not kind, it rises enough. This morning, the mail came late. I did not stand at the window. I moved through the rooms that know my weight and greeted the day as a woman who has finally understood that she is not a story other people tell, but the teller, the breath, the long exhale after the last period when the page is turned and the light keeps going. I put on water for tea. I stepped onto the porch. On the road, dust settled where earlier a truck had passed. It settled everywhere, in the way of dust, on the railing, on my hands, on the history that refuses to be polished out of the wood. I wiped it away. I have learned at last how to live with what remains.